perspective, from UNA USA's perspective, the importance of this convening and how it connects to other things the division has done, which Ginger just mentioned, and other convenings like this that we've done over the last 18 months from New York to Hawaii. And just to put it in context, last week in Washington, we celebrated the 70th anniversary of the ratification of the UN Charter by the US Senate. So it was 70 years ago, this time, that the guiding document that would later lead to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that would propel so much of what we do and what that institution 2 blocks away does, was being crafted. And for those of you who I know so well, who are our chapter leaders, who have got a blue grounds pass on your neck, who kind of are dyed in the wool in the UN system, I think the language of the Charter kind of rolls off your tongue, and you think back to the first line of the Charter, which was written by the one woman on the U.S. delegation to the negotiation of the Charter, Virginia Gildersleeve. And it begins with, "We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war." And to me, what's exciting about that, and what it connects to what you're doing today here, and what so many of our chapters have done around the country, is that the UN's a member state institution, was then, still is. It's about the nations of the world convening and addressing huge global problems. But it began with this ambition of a role for individuals to play their own role, to have their own impact in touching, driving, affecting the policy process within that international context. And we are finally, I think at this point, 70 years into this great experiment of multilateralism, at a point where we're seeing what it looks like. And it looks like this. The fact that a global norm has been established, that every single member state is subject to periodic review of their human rights record, and that you have these platforms where we pull citizens from New York State, and we pull great legislative leaders like the senator, who have a real role in driving what the human rights agenda will be in the United States, and that all becomes part of the official human rights record that the U.S. is held to account to in the Human Rights Council, and becomes part of our dialogue with the State Department. That's a new innovation. And we're really at the tipping point of new possibilities for individuals to play a role in the policy process of the UN. So I think that this is an exciting thing. The division has been a great leader on, and it's a living process. Our staff has sat at the State Department, where all the recommendations that have come out of these UPR reviews are articulated, and the State Department defends them back. We monitor what happens in the Human Rights Council. We've got 16 specific recommendations that are part of that record that the U.S. will be held to account on. So you're part of something real, is the basic message that I'm trying to convey. That we're internationalists. The people who are members of our organization are global citizens by definition. So often what we do is get together and talk about big global challenges, but when we convene around something like UPR, it's about doing more than talking about it. It's about driving a global norm and being part in an individual way in one of the most important policy processes going on in the international system. So thank you for investing your time in this, and we look forward to ensuring that it connects to all those different processes going around the United States that we're hosting, the work in Geneva, the work across the street, and the work back in Washington. Thank you.
President and acting mayor, was vice president of the Urban Renewal Board, voting member of the Board of Estimate, vice chair of the Real Estate Board, and chair of the Capital Projects Board. And her other committees included legislation and public works, human resources, finance and planning, public safety, and codes. She's a multi-talented and multi-experienced person. She's a nurse and worked for many years, from 1963 to 1998, as a nurse counselor for Mount Vernon Hospital. She's founding president of The Gathering, a volunteer-staffed women's center in Mount Vernon. She was a health educator with the Mount Vernon Neighborhood Health Centers Initiative. She also worked with the Unsung Heroes. She was honored with the Unsung Heroes Award presented by AIDS-related Community Services, ARCS organization. She has won many, many other awards. She's the recipient of 2 honorary doctorate degrees from Mercy College and from Eastern Theological Seminary, and is alumna of Bronx Community College. She's widowed with 2 daughters and is an adoring grandmother, I am sure, of 2. Her standing committee assignments right now are Judiciary, Crime Victims, Crime and Corrections, Commerce, Economic Development, Small Business, and Consumer Protection, Ethics, Rules, and she chairs the Senate Task Force on Domestic Violence, and also chairs the Haiti Assistance and Relief Task Force. Now, what I really wanted to tell you about is that she also was enstooled as Mputu Hema for the people of Akwamu, which is in eastern Ghana, and she was given the stool name Nana Adobea I of the 17 provinces and villages that make up the eastern region. Again, in common, David and I lived in Togo and Ghana, so we know that one well. I welcome you to tell us about your work in the Senate and the important work that the Senate is doing in the criminal justice area.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I shared with Ginger that I prepared a sort of formal presentation, primarily because of time constraints. I mean, I could go on and on and on, and those of you who, stop it, Brenda, around this table, you too, David, around this table who know me very well, know that I could go on any subject for infinitum, but there is a time constraint, so I would try to stay with it. But I'd like to just explain a couple of things that you have in front of you. All of you have a copy, I think, of this blue book, and let me just explain how this book emanated. The former chair of the Democratic Conference, when he took the chair and we became the majority for that very short infinitesimal moment that Democrats were in charge of the Senate, came before the body and said to each of us, as we were chairs of committees, he wanted us to put together a goals presentation of the things that we'd like to see accomplished. And so I didn't have any clue as to what he was expecting, but I do have to tell you that I'm not only verbally gifted, but I write. And we ended up giving him 50 pages of things that we thought should and could happen, during that period. And when I got to conference that day and he was sharing, he held up my blue book, not this one, but my blue book, and said, this came from one member, this came from another member. Somewhere in between is what I expect that people are going to be doing. And I felt very uncomfortable because I thought I'd put my colleagues on the spot, but like I said, he was brand new, we were new to our committees, so we had no idea what the expectation was. But this book was reflective of the result, because after 2 years, and who knew that we were not going to be there in the majority in the next cycle. But this is a result of what happened in the 2-year period that I chaired, Crime Victims and Corrections. And I have to, without being boastful at all, my staff and I did an extraordinary job, we think, of changing a whole social justice agenda in that 2-year period. And this is reflective of the things that we did accomplish. And so we accomplished, and when I went before the chair of the committee, he said, don't you think this is a little ambitious? But when we finished, 96% of everything that we presented, we were successful in achieving. including our participation and work on Rockefeller drug law. But I don't want to get ahead of my story because some of that I've written. But I felt very good about that, and I felt good about it because we started with a what we call the 2020 vision. And for 2020, there were things that we wanted to see accomplished, and we were challenged to set the groundwork for how we were going to get there. And so this, as I said, this was reflective in, we had a little bit of money, so I was able to get this printed, and it looked good, and I want to tell you, this is the 15th printing, because people continue to ask for it, and it's somewhat of a guidepost in terms of some of the things that we were able to do. Mr. Watley and I know each other because I was fortunate to have been selected also to be a Toll Fellow. And as a result, Senator Toll created a leadership training for senators, and I was one of those that was selected to participate and go to Kentucky for a week, and it was an extraordinary experience, second only to the experience I'm looking forward to. I think that going to Harvard to their training is like the only other thing that is on par with that Toll training. But it also put me also as a member of the Council of State Government Officials, and I served for a short time as the regional person representing New York State. And now I represent the Women's Division in Women in Government as a result of some of that work. So let me just start by officially thanking Dr. Brenda Smith for suggesting me as a presenter for this forum, and for Ginger Stillman, who's president of this division, for bringing together this talented group of people to discuss several of the critical issues affecting the criminal justice system. Assembled, as I've learned today, are representatives from government, universities, media, faith-based organizations, and the criminal justice system, here today to engage in a conversation about how do we make New York State's criminal justice system better. Thank you again, Ginger, for continuing your efforts too to make life better for people all around the world. President Stillman has asked me to share with you some of my views on the major criminal justice issues that have a direct impact on people of color in the state of New York, and to suggest ways to improve some of the conditions that we will discuss. As I preface my remarks, allow me to raise two questions. Number one, do advocacy groups make a difference? And number two, can government work to make things better? The answer to both questions, in my opinion, are yes. On good days, the voice of people motivate government to work effectively, and on even better days, though not every day, government makes laws that change things, that make a big difference, and advance the causes of freedom and justice. For instance, in 2010, New York State government abolished draconian drug sentencing policies with a package of alternative drug addiction, and gives defendants the opportunity to end the cycle of criminal conduct by treating the disease of addiction. 5 years ago, New York State abolished the Rockefeller drug sentencing law. And 5 years later, crime is down. The prison population is down by 20,000. We have closed 12 prisons, and in the process have saved the taxpayers millions of dollars. But more importantly, saved the lives of people. We have changed the modality from punitive to medical, and the people of New York are better for it. In 2010, advocates and government worked together to ensure that the people in prison were counted at their addresses prior to incarceration. In 2009, 75% of the New York State prison population were people of color. Those 40,000 inmates were counted as residents of upstate prisons. And I will put a pin in saying that one of those prisons had more people inside the prison than in the community itself.
Wow.
And so this allowed them, thereby diverting census tax dollars to upstate communities instead of where the inmates actually came from cities such as Syracuse, Rochester, Albany, and New York City. A delegation of legislators and former legislators met with the president to try to get a national movement around this and were not successful. But we did not stop at that, because in New York State, we pushed to make that change. By changing the law, congressional lines and tax resources are based on where people normally live and not where they're in prison. Why is this important? Because the formula for basic federal funding is based on those census numbers. Approximately $500 per person for each year over a 10-year period is awarded to that state based upon the people who are counted. So advocacy does work, and advocacy of the people makes government work better. Some of the major issues that the state government tackled this year was a special prosecutor. In July, just last month, Governor Cuomo issued an executive order 147, which authorizes the New York State Attorney General to take over cases from the local district attorney where an unarmed civilian dies while in police custody or is killed during a police-civilian encounter. The governor had promised to issue this order if the legislature failed to enact legislation that he found acceptable. What many of you may not know is that the advocates and legislators helped to shape this executive order by fiercely fighting for more aggressive responses to cases like Eric Garner in Staten Island. In 2015, I sponsored legislation S5592, which says that where an unarmed civilian is killed by a member of law enforcement, the New York State Attorney General would act as a special prosecutor and supersede the jurisdiction of the local district attorney. Now, let me just ad lib for 1 second on this. There was a tremendous amount of pushback on the part of the governor. In the Senate, I carried the Senate version. In the Assembly, Keith Wright carried the same language for a bill. The Assembly passed their version of the bill, but the Senate majority refused to do so. They did not want a special prosecutor. They didn't even want a monitor. We didn't want a monitor, those of us in the Democratic Conference, and I pushed very, very hard not to have a monitor, because the monitor really almost puts you in the same position that you're in now, and it puts the governor in charge of how this will happen. Legislation kickstarts this. When an action happens, it automatically means that the Attorney General becomes the prime investigator on these cases. So it does not have to be deliberated and decided by anyone else. And that was what we pushed for. And the District Attorneys Association pushed back very, very hard. And many of the members of the Senate majority are sort of the voice and the mouthpiece for the DAs. And so they were very resistant. Some of them for the right reasons, but most of them because of protection of turf. I have been in Albany for 16 years, and I think the current DA for Albany County has probably been there for 10 of those 16 years. As soon as I made my presentation in a hearing before the DA's Association, he suddenly wanted to have lunch with me after 16 years. And so I checked with the Ethics Committee to see whether he could, I should, and who should pay. And we did have lunch, and he shared with me not only this issue, but raise the age, which I will talk about briefly in the presentation, which is another major piece that we had severe pushback from. But he made a case that in most instances made some sense from his perspective. But it didn't make sense from the perspective of the failure on the part of government to understand that there is such mistrust that exists within our communities as to the closeness and the close-knit relationship that exists between the police that investigate and the DA, who admonishes the jury as well as tries these cases. My first foray into this area, and while there were many, many cases prior to this across the country, the one that was closest to home for me, which kick-started my concern about this issue, was a young man whose dad I knew, Officer Ridley, who was off duty in Westchester County, broke up a fight and ended up dead because the court clerks shot him to death. We had a community-wide meeting, a series of meetings regarding it. And at one of the meetings, the DA from Westchester, I admonished not her, but the system, the process, because it was very clear that there was not the sense that this case would be fairly adjudicated. Not because we were trying to do a witch hunt on the officers, but we wanted to be sure that justice was going to be done. And it gave us a real first close look at the relationship that does exist between the police and the DA, and so hence our concern. Well, needless to say, it took her about 6 years to begin to speak to me again with any civility, but I still hold to that because I needed her to understand that it was not personal to her, but it was personal to the process. And that because I was sitting where people said, you have to do something, say something, you know, they say if you see something, say something. So I saw something, and I saw something that I felt was the linchpin for most people in the public in terms of how do we restore trust in our government at any level. And this was one of the things that we presented as a way to at least, we hope, would ameliorate the concern that the local DA's relationship to the police that they not only supervise, but they get advice from and get information from, and the relationship just seemed too close just based on the way it was structured.
Absolutely.
So I was very happy when it, when it became the hue and cry across the country that there was something wrong with this picture. And so it allowed us then to begin to push our legislature and the families. We encouraged the families to continue dialogue with the governor. And we did not want to let the governor off the hook because he was not comfortable doing this. And I will say this very openly, and he knows that because I've said it to him. But whatever we needed to do to push him, to let him know, number one, he had our support on this. But he really needed to understand the feeling that the community was experiencing to ensure that everything we could do to give the sense of separation and clarity of lines that we needed to be able to do this. And so I was so pleased to be there. I brought my pen, but I'm not taking it out because I don't want it to disappear. But I carry my pen every day that the governor used to sign this executive order, because even though he didn't give me any credit for the language that he used in the bill, I am just happy to know that the language of my bill, if you put it side by side with the executive order, you will see that I'm in there. My fingerprints are all over that. And so that those are kind of things that become important. But the executive order permits the judge to be present in a grand jury and supervised proceedings. And unlike the executive order, my bill would have permitted disclosure of certain grand jury instructions that would help the public better understand the process. So those are the two pieces that are missing in the executive order. But I am very hopeful, and I've told some of my colleagues, even though I probably will not be returning to the Senate, I am prayerful that they will continue to press to make sure that the legislation passed that does give a greater sense of security to the public, that that we do mean that justice is more important than just a quick down and dirty case that's solved.
I'm going to ask you to give about 2 more minutes max, because
Right.
I want you to know who else is in the room, so that when we break into groups, we'll know each other, and
Right.
if
Okay.
another group that the senator is not in needs her, she can join. and we can all do that, okay?
Sure.
So, please.
And the other thing that I wanted to raise that I think was a major issue for us is raise the age. And New York is one of the only 2 states in the country that has failed to recognize what research and science has confirmed, and that is that adolescents are children. And prosecuting and placing them in the adult criminal system doesn't work for them and doesn't work for public safety. But New York continues to be the only state other than North Carolina that prosecutes all youth as adults when they turn 16 years of age. Brain development science is clear. Adolescents are different from adults. Research into brain development underscores that adolescents are in fact children and that the human brain is not fully formed until the age of 20. As the cognitive skills of adolescents are developing, adolescent behavior is also often impulsive, and adolescents lack the ability to focus on consequences of their behavior. Because the adolescent brain is still developing, the character, personality traits, and behavior of adolescents are highly receptive to change. Adolescents respond well to interventions. They learn to make responsible choices and are likely to grow out of negative, delinquent behavior with the right kind of guidance. Prison, however, is not the answer within a full-blown facility. The struggle to raise the age of criminal liability continues in New York State. For the past several years, I've co-sponsored along with Senator Velma Montgomery the bill which continues to find resistance from upstate Republicans where the prisons are. But one of the things that we have been able at least to do is bring some of our children into facilities closer to home. Now, I'm not as pleased with the closer to home results as I would be, but everybody was so anxious to have it that they did not wait until we really did a true analysis, in my opinion, of where they should have been placed. But everybody they want to do a photo op, and so that they're more anxious to get the photo op done, get credit, as opposed to really doing the kind of science and assessment that needs to be done, but that work continues. But to his credit, the governor attempted to raise the age in the budget. However, it came off the table in terms of discussion, but funding remains in the budget at the moment as a placeholder. I admonish this group, and you're fortunate.
Yes, we're fortunate. And I was so glad that Brenda said, you should come. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
I would like to start and go around the room. Let's see. Let's start with Dory. And just stand up and tell everybody who you are. And I know who you are, but let's hear it.
I'm Dory Sauda. I'm an intern at the Miss Foundation for Women through the Brotherhood Sister Soul.
With the Miss Foundation for Women. Don't break your camera on my behalf. She's beautiful, I guess. So I think that for the first thing that we wanted to start by saying in terms of our report back is that I think in typical women's fashion, we went against the grain, right? So we didn't necessarily go through, I think, each of the sections and look at national, state, local in that order, but our conversation was robust and captured it all, I think in our estimation, and we're queuing ourselves up for another conversation, right? So I think there's more time for you to come, Sarah.
Great.
So the first piece that I think we wanted to point out is we looked at the recommendations as they were sent to us beforehand, but with the exception, I think, of recommendation 5.129 and 5.230, there are no other recommendations that explicitly name women, girls, or transgender people. And so that, I think, was like the first, red flag for us and the point that we wanted to address, and that felt a bit problematic. So we kind of, approached our conversation from the perspective of what would it look like for us to put forth a set of recommendations or even have a conversation that would be the precursor to gender-specific recommendations within the realm of reforming the criminal and justice system as we currently see it, right? So looking at sort of the pathways to confinement/incarceration for women, so looking at sentencing reform, and then also looking at what happens within the prison industrial complex or the system as it currently stands. So I think the first section, we looked sort of the pathway to prison, if you will, It's a place where I think is inundated by incidents of intimate partner violence, so domestic violence of all forms, but also violence on the street, so violence in the home, and violence of in places of employment. So we really want to look at the particular ways in which women, gender nonconforming folks, and transgender women are subject to forms of violence that then end up having them be incarcerated in a place where I think that second section lives, where they're then subject to more forms of violence, right? So the re-traumatization of women within the prison system. We I think very specifically use the language of women, recognizing that I think there's a consensus across the board that we're actually looking at abolishing incarceration for young people. So we actually don't want to have a conversation about the incarceration of girls because we don't want girls to be incarcerated. So whether it's attached to a sort of raise the age campaign or what have you, but when we talk about minor young women, we want to see like sort of a programming out of the prison system. In terms of recommendations, I think we have them across the board. We really want to lift up our comrades at Black Women's Blueprint and all the work that they've been doing in conjunction with CEDAW. And so we think that it would be worth all of our benefit to see actually the CEDAW recommendations that are already on the table and to be in conversation around those. So I think there's a commitment coming out of this for us all to get them and then see if there's like a point of conversation to jump off from there. I think that would guide us in our conversation around so what would it take for us to really be transitioning folks out of the prison system? So that means there's got to be some sort of reform and training around safety. So using that, like I think that large frame of safety for folks while they're incarcerated and on their way out and on their way in re-entering society. So there's both a community aspect as well as a sort of behind the bars aspect, right? Understanding that once folks are behind the bars, once women are behind bars, they're perpetrators of violence, and those that are breaching the safety contract are agents of the state, right? So that there's state-sanctioned violence that oftentimes lays folks into prison, right, or has them even in holding cells, right? So we name the fact that, like, let's just be real about where we are in this moment, right? On what is the 5th day of August, in the last 30 days, at least 6 Black women have been found dead in police custody, right? Most of them, their first interaction that landed them in police custody that then led to their death was assumingly a minor infraction, right? And so there's really a conversation that we need to have about what is the point of engagement that lands folks into literally a deadly situation. And then if they survive that encounter, right, and they make it behind bars, then what is happening with those who are entrusted with their safety to actually keep them safe? So there's I think that's a huge bulk of the conversation. Again, really coming back to CEDAW. And then there are a couple of local campaigns to bring it down to the local level. We all are representatives of some form of an organization or entity. And so we really talked about how we can engage with some existing campaigns. There's some stuff here on the local level in New York City, looking at racial profiling and stop and frisk. So we want to look at, I think, the incident of the Floyd case and what that lawsuit has sort of broken open for the city of New York, and how we can enter that with a gender lens. There's the Breaking Silence campaign. There's a campaign that that Black Women's Blueprint is leading around their Black Women's Truth and Reconciliation project, and they're taking folks to testify before Congress. So I think we'll stop there. Lots more in terms of the conversation, and one of the proposals on the table at the very least from the Ms. Foundation is to convene this subgroup again at the request or at the desire of folks here.
Thank you.
And we talked about the fact that if you are not a fluent reader by the time that you reach the end of 3rd grade, there is an 80% chance that you will wind up incarcerated. We talked about the fact that children like the ones that I was responsible for on a daily basis enter school with approximately a 3,000 word vocabulary, and their counterparts 1.5 miles, 2 miles away enter school with a 30,000 word vocabulary. And that 27,000 word differential very rarely gets closed. So we looked at the fact, we looked at a backwards design to identify our desired results, which obviously is to make them productive members of society. We looked at determining acceptable levels of engagement and funding, and finally at the activities that it would take to get them there to where they need to be. When we took the template that you gave us, and Senator Thompson, you'll be happy to see this, we decided that on a national level, there would need to be policy and legislation for family and community engagement, for FACE. That on a national level, the government would need to decide that that was what needed to be done in all schools across the country. We then saw the state's responsibility as mandating first and foremost teacher/educator re-education. We talked about the fact that when a child goes into a classroom, how I perceive his behavior as opposed to how you might perceive his behavior. I might say suspend him and you may say redirect him. So we need to look at the behaviors of the children. We need to lower the suspension rates. It is very obvious in the data that little black boys are seen as problematic and little white boys are seen as inquisitive. And they have exactly the same behavior. The perceptions of how children behave impact their time out of the classroom. So teacher, educator mandated re-education on the state level. Then we would make the districts responsible for implementation and monitoring of parent engagement. When I first started talking before, I said that there is a big difference between parent engagement and parent involvement. If I invite you in for tea and crumpets to sit around a table, you are involved, but you are not engaged. Right now, through Title I funding, teachers and administrators get paid to create a plan for their school each year. It's called a SEP, School Comprehensive Educational Plan. 50% of the people at the table must be parents, but through the Title I funding, I can pay myself as the educator or the administrator, pay the teachers, but I can't pay the parents. So I'm asking you to take time off from your job to be at a table while I get paid and you don't. Do I really value you? Do I really want to engage you? So those kinds of things need to be made more equitable. We need to eliminate the disparities, and the local organizations need to do the political work for us, need to make the politicians and the masses understand that we need to go from a punitive mindset to a corrective mindset. We need to correct the problem before it exists. If it does find its way into existence, we do not, just like you, need to see young people incarcerated, but rather have their behaviors and their mindsets redirected. Thank you.
Russell Thompson with us the whole time. She had promised that she was going to float. We took advantage of the fact that she was sitting at my elbow and blocked from the door. What we did, and I'm going to ask our rapporteur to give some of the points that were included in the actual discussion. But what we did at large was to try to shape something that could be useful to her. And we had, as an example, two things that could be very, very helpful. One is a letter that was written to the chairman and the ranking member of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. And this was a letter just a couple weeks ago, July 14th, produced by the Sentencing Project, and which has 60 undersigned organizations. Just as the senator had earlier said that she managed to get some things moving but never got credit, it's also true that we have a colleague here who helped to write this, and her name doesn't show up in here, but she's promised to help us with what we would like to do, and that is not only from our own working group, but from the three working groups, on behalf of the organization, to have something that goes to her and to others that may be identified on behalf of those who so desire to have their organizations written into the co-sponsoring of this. And the other thing was that the governor last year in February had announced a plan to help prisoners get college degrees. And this failed for various reasons. And this newspaper article from the Journal News, our local newspaper in Lower Westchester, has her name in it. Senator Ruth Hassel Thompson says a college education is a vital asset for men and women to move forward with their lives after prison. And so we want to see if there are ways to help advance this. And the senator has said that there was a lot of pushback from those who had various reasons for not supporting this idea, but we should push back the pushback. So perhaps we can do that too. Now I'd like to ask Peter DiBartolo to bring out some of the points that were raised during our discussions.
Great, thank you, David. So we had an excellent conversation and really a dynamic discussion about a number of topics. I tried my best to kind of reframe these into recommendations. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these as really bullet points. Recommendations. Develop more comprehensive reentry preparation programs for former offenders, which will deliberately address the wide range of collateral consequences of conviction, such as implications for public housing, employment, civil rights, right to vote. Provide information assistance in navigating the post-incarceration landscape. Also consider the Fulton Correctional Model as a one-stop shop for former offenders when they get out. Also expand educational programs, GED and higher educational programs within prisons. Directly link this initiative to the impact on communities and reduce recidivism rates. What was highlighted in the conversation is that those who do not receive educational programs in prison have about a 44% recidivism rate. Those who receive educational programs in prison have less than a 4% recidivism rate. And if the public understood this as a recidivism issue, they would most likely be more in favor of promoting these educational programs. Also, we would like to promote closer and more transparent review of who serves on and is represented on rural boards. Develop a more proactive engagement approach with communities about closing prisons and expand transitional training programs for community members residing in areas where prisons will close. Develop additional economic opportunities and alternatives for such communities so that they can survive the closure of the prison. Within New York, a number of upstate areas, specifically in the Adirondacks, have challenges in this kind of area. Additionally, we would create cross-departmental and or cross-constituency task forces to discuss sentencing to meaningfully engage all stakeholders. Also advocate the eradication of mandatory minimum sentencing. Advance the Ban the Box campaign to reduce the use of the question about conviction from job applications. Reconsider and revisit the use of parole versus sentencing guidelines and their effectiveness, one approach versus the other. Also push for reduction of the use of solitary confinement. Advocate for changes in regulation and or interpretations of statutes and policies on former offenders obtaining public housing. Reconsider the time limits prohibiting former offenders from voting. Promote a shift in public discourse and cultural understanding of incarceration to reframe discussion in terms of rehabilitation, community building, and reducing recidivism. And also continue to resist the privatization of prisons in New York State and throughout the United States.